On July 23, 2015, in Elkhart, Indiana, firefighters arrived at the bizarre scene of an apartment building. Outside, near the door, laid a bloody knife. Inside one of the bedrooms, they discovered the body of a mother of two. Who was this victim, and who was the monster who had murdered her and set the family's house on fire? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Late in the night of July 23, 2015, the first responding officer, Daniel Meyer, arrived on the scene of an apartment fire in Elkhart, Indiana. He observed a large amount of blood in the hallway of the building. There was a trail of blood that ran up the stairs and stopped on the third floor. Near one of the doors, he discovered a bloody knife. The apartment was overflowing with smoke. Officer Meyer donned a gas mask he had inside his car before entering the residence. When the fire department arrived and surveyed the apartment, they found a woman lying on the floor of one of the bedrooms. They rushed the woman to the hospital, where she was pronounced deceased. The victim was identified as 50-year-old Maria Torres. Autopsy results would reveal that the woman's official cause of death was from multiple stab wounds to her torso and face, including a stab wound made to her chest that was 3 3/4 inches deep. Edwin Torres and his daughter were traumatized by the night's events, barely able to speak to officers about the horror that had transpired. The father told the police that his 12-year-old daughter had attacked his wife, stabbed him, and set their home on fire. The girl, identified only as JT, had fled to unknown whereabouts after he had gotten the knife away from her. Officers were stunned by what they were hearing. A 12-year-old girl who had stabbed her stepmother to death, attacked her father, and started a fire in hopes to kill them all. An APB was immediately dispatched to locate the missing child, who was now a suspect in first-degree murder and arson. Early the next morning, a man was abruptly awakened by an unexpected knocking at his front door. There stood 2 young girls he had never seen before. They claimed that they had been hiking in the area with their families, but somehow they got lost on the trail. The girls were very hungry and asked him if he had some food. The man, who was later identified as Zachary Sleeper, found their claims to be a bit suspicious, since there were no hiking trails nearby, and he noticed that one of the girls was barefoot. He told them, though, he was happy to call their families, but they avoided this and never gave him any contact information. Mr. Sleeper told them that he would go inside and cook them something, but he wanted them to remain on the porch, hungry, desperate, and without a real plan. The girls obliged. He called the police while he made some food for the girls, believing them to be runaways. Little did he know, he had just helped capture a murderer. When the police arrived at his residence, they immediately brought the girls into custody. Due to minor privacy laws, the 2 12-year-old girls are referred to by their initials, JT and JP. Inside one of the girls' backpacks, officers discovered pants with bloodstains. When investigators interviewed the girl known as JP, she swore that the pants were not hers. She told them they belonged to her friend, JT. She also shared with the police how her friend JT had more than one personality. It was determined that the girl had no involvement in the crime, and she was released into her parents' custody. While under investigation, 12-year-old JT remained in custody at the Elkhart County Juvenile Detention Center. During the homicide investigation, it was learned that the following sequence of events occurred on the night of July 23, 2015. After she made plans via text to meet up with her friend JP later that night, 12-year-old JT hung out with her family as if everything was normal. She talked with both her father Edwin and stepmother Maria while they ate dinner together and watched TV. Her father would later describe the bizarre and disturbing grin his daughter wore on her face. He said she kept exposing all of her teeth when she smiled. Edwin Torres also shared how his daughter had been standing in a weird, unnatural pose, although she kept reassuring him that everything was fine. Later that night, when her half-brother was out of the house and her half-sister had already gone to bed, JT lit her room ablaze. Her stepmother suddenly awoke to a loud sound and smelled smoke. She walked over to JT's bedroom. As she opened the door, smoke bellowed out into the hall. Then she saw JT. The young girl was standing in the middle of her bedroom. She wasn't saying a word. Her father awoke to this commotion and rushed into the room. A fire was burning on the floor, and an even larger one was blazing inside her closet. Maria pulled JT away from the fire and into the hallway as her father tried to extinguish it. Then he heard his wife screaming, saying that JT had a knife. When he came back into the hallway, he watched as his wife Maria was knocking on their daughter's door. She opened the door, still half asleep, and saw her mother, soaked in blood. "I'm dying, call the police," were the last words her mother ever spoke to her. She frantically dialed 911. Meanwhile, JT's father saw her standing by the front door of the apartment. She was wielding a knife and was standing strangely. He told her they all needed to leave or they would die in the fire. JT looked into her father's eyes and warned him to stay back, telling him to not get any closer to her. She spoke to him in a creepy, clown-like voice. He ignored what she said, and JT swung at her father with the blade. Edwin Torres opened the door, and they struggled with the knife toward the hallway of the building. He got the knife away from his daughter, tossing it aside, but he could not stop JT as she ran away from the apartment into the night. Once Edwin Torres stopped moving around, he saw that JT had slashed one of his arms, and he was bleeding profusely. Even so, he ran back into the apartment to rescue his other daughter, who told him that she thought Mom was dead. The two rushed to safety outside the apartment and waited for law enforcement and the fire department to arrive. When officers interviewed JT, trying to understand what possible motive this young girl had for wanting her parents dead, she told them she did it because Laughing Jack told her to. Laughing Jack is a creepypasta character. Creepypastas are horror-related legends that have been created and shared online. Coined in 2007, it's the blending of the words creepy and copypasta, which is slang for copy and paste. Essentially, they have become the modern-day internet form of legends and folklore. This user-created content features stories and images of the paranormal, including ghosts, rituals, zombies, aliens, cryptids, and more, often with a homicidal or suicidal edge. Their appeal is similar to tales of legend and lore shared around a campfire, except these are spread via the internet. They weave some truths with first-person narration around make-believe characters and stories. Instead of by word of mouth, these dark tales spread like a virus, being copied and pasted through digital channels, reaching a massive audience. Creepypastas are also represented through images, videos, and even interactive games. They have also found influence in various films like Slender Man and all seasons of Sci-Fi Channel's Channel Zero, which are based on different creepypasta characters. Channel Zero is one of the most compelling, fascinating, and disturbing series I have ever seen, especially creepy during this spooky season. But really anytime, I would highly recommend watching this bizarre and extremely unique show. Being into dark and creepy characters sounds relatively normal for teens and preteens to be interested in. I myself watched very violent, disturbing slasher horror films as a preteen. Although I was fascinated by these evil characters portrayed on screen, even at 7 years old I knew the villains weren't real, much less did I attempt to emulate them. Creepypasta characters are often portrayed as being ominous, mysterious, and extremely violent, and the line between reality and fantasy has been known to blur for some of its fans and users. Creepypastas are now infamously associated for inciting fanatic, even erratic, and homicidal behavior shown by some of its viewers. The Slender Man character has become infamous when two 12-year-old girls who were obsessed with the fantasy villain lured to the woods and stabbed their friend, 12-year-old Peyton Lautner, to appease Slenderman and prove to the world that he was real. Fortunately and incredibly, this brave young girl survived despite being stabbed 19 times. As a result, web administrators of many creepypastas posted statements reminding their users and fans of the line between fantasy and reality. Creepypasta stories and images seem to hold an abnormally strong impression over especially young children, some of whom have become confused about what is real and what is fantasy. This violent and disturbing act committed by two 12-year-old girls against their friend occurred less than a year before JT murdered her stepmother. No one in JT's life was paying attention to the media she was consuming, specifically the subject of her fascination, who was a clown called Laughing Jack. Yet JT never hid her obsession with the dark, sinister clown character. JT and her friend JP, who was one of the few friends the girl had, first met in 5th grade. They shared a love for the spookier side of things and wrote horror stories they referred to as creepypastas. A lot of their time together, as well as alone, was spent writing and reading these tales of sadistic and bizarre supernatural beings who commonly killed and tortured innocent people, including children. So who is Laughing Jack? You may be curious to know. Laughing Jack would be a typical looking clown, except that he wore a black and white costume and was properly illustrated holding knives. What may be the most disturbing aspect about Laughing Jack is his origin story. Laughing Jack is the story of a clown who became consumed by darkness and twisted by vengeance when he was betrayed by the child he loved. Originally, Laughing Jack was a fun, light-hearted creature created by a guardian angel. Laughing Jack was a bright and colorful jack-in-the-box clown who mirrored the personality of his owners. In 1800s London, he was sent to be the imaginary friend of a young boy named Isaac Grossman. Isaac Grossman was a very impoverished and lonely little boy. His father was a violent drunk who abused and sexually assaulted his mother. Little Isaac would cry in silence and shiver in his pea-stained bed, listening and waiting for the terrifying sounds to stop. The boy would dream about having a friend, one whom he could play games with and laugh together, and help him escape his dark existence. Then one Christmas, when Isaac was 7 years old, a wooden box appeared with his name on its tag. It was a Laughing Jack in the box. At first, he thought the toy was broken, because when he wound it up, nothing happened, except that the song Pop Goes the Weasel played. Then, out of nowhere, Laughing Jack appeared. He was very tall, brightly dressed, and real. The boy and his clown had great times together, and all was happy and well in Laughing Jack's and Isaac's world. At least, for a little while. That is, until the little boy forgot about him. Isaac left for boarding school and abandoned Laughing Jack. 13 years passed without Isaac ever saying hello to his friend in the box. Over time, the clown began to lack any emotion, and he lost his bright colors, slowly turning black and white. As Isaac Grossman grew into an adult, he turned brutal, violent, and buried in darkness. He had become a serial killer. He mercilessly kidnapped, tortured, and murdered multiple people in his neighborhood. Isaac would commit heinous acts in front of the clown's box. Laughing Jack was shocked and horrified at what his once innocent and gentle young friend had turned into. But just as the guardian angel had created him, Laughing Jack began to reflect the evil inside Isaac. One day, Laughing Jack freed himself from the box. This time, he appeared as an even taller, darker, and sinister version of who he once was. The clown was seething with rage, hatred, and vengeance toward his owner, who had abandoned him and become a monster. So, he found Isaac. Laughing Jack tortured and killed him with the exact weapons Isaac had used on his victims. But murdering Isaac Grossman was not enough to satisfy the hunger of the murderous, twisted clown. He went on a killing spree. First, he would befriend lonely and neglected children, and then he would torture and murder them one by one. In one of Laughing Jack's stories, he stabbed his victims before removing their organs, which in turn, he placed pieces of candy inside. Laughing Jack trapped these innocent young souls within a twisted fairground. The place was abandoned and full of nightmarish creatures and sights, and the song, "Pop Goes the Weasel," accompanied them for eternity. JT became obsessed with Laughing Jack and even wrote a story about him featuring herself. Together, they shared candy. There was even a picture JT drew of herself and Laughing Jack together, which JP later described to the police. Sometime in late May or beginning of June in the year she killed Maria, JT's father discovered inappropriate and dark pictures she had drawn of Laughing Jack. JT began to emulate Laughing Jack. She mimicked his dress and behavior. She began wearing black and white clothes, like Laughing Jack does. She painted her face in white and black, just like him. And the young girl became obsessed with candy, Laughing Jack's favorite thing. After the night of the murder, JT was initially held at the Juvenile Delinquency Corrections Facility. When she arrived, she told staff members that she would bite for any reason at any time, but that if she carried some candy, it decreased her urge to bite people. 11 days after the murder and arson occurred, the staff discovered 2 pieces of paper inside JT's room. She had written the word candy over and over and over again on the first piece, and on the second piece, she had written out the lyrics to "Pop Goes the Weasel." When the Slender Man-related attack happened, members of the community wanted to understand how some children have difficulty distinguishing between reality and fantasy. Dr. David Lowenstein, a psychiatrist, specifically addressed some of the factors that may culminate in this issue. Desensitization has long been a factor in the study of violent media on adolescents. Research has consistently shown that repetitive exposure to violence can lead to increased aggressive behavior. Such overexposure to violent media, no matter its form, whether it is movies, television, video games, can create emotional detachment and prevent some individuals from perceiving death and homicide within the context of reality. Dr. Lowenstein also addressed how adolescents who struggle with their mental health are particularly vulnerable to being negatively affected by violent media. For children who use the online fantasy world to escape their lives, some become so entranced by this imaginary world that it is difficult for them to distinguish between the two. The third main factor is the developing brain of the child or teenager. It is a simple fact that young people process information differently from adults. When their emotions dominate their thinking, this can lead them to behave and think in irrational ways. Dr. Lowenstein's main recommendation for avoiding potential concerns with a child who is incapable of deciphering between reality and fantasy is to monitor their media usage. I think that is the mere starting point, and that parents must discuss with their children what they are viewing and what it means to them. Censoring what a child watches does not prevent them from becoming an aggressive or potentially violent individual. It is well known that when a parent tells their child not to do something, this typically only drives the child to want to do it more. I have discussed in past episodes the impact of violent content on an individual's psyche and their potential for or risk of committing violent acts. I covered the psychotic delusions experienced by David Gonzalez of England, who believed he was Freddy Krueger in episode 55, A Nightmare in England. And in episode 11, Dead Rising, I discussed the brutal slaughter committed by Spain's video game-obsessed Andrew Coulter. By the way, if you have not listened to either one of these, please do. They are both compelling and horrific stories and very relevant to this discussion. Now, the research has been mixed on the impact violent media has on people, specifically adolescents and their brains. One side states that violent content is known for escalating aggression and can trigger violence in some viewers, where the other side argues there is no direct correlation between violent media and violent acts. There are arguments presented with empirical evidence to support both sides. However, almost all studies and mental health professionals agree that when someone, in particular a child or adolescent, has a propensity for violence, being exposed to a large amount of violent and dark material can harm their psyche. Whether it is a result of a mental illness or psychopathy, overexposure to violent media can trigger aggression and even violent behavior. It was evident that no one was paying attention to, much less caring about, the violent, twisted stories and imagery 12-year-old JT had become obsessed with. Her already fragile mental health was further impacted by her unhealthy infatuation with the serial killer clown, Laughing Jack. There was strong evidence that supported JT's mounting symptoms of her mental illness, specifically her dissociative identity disorder, before, on the day of the act, and days and months after the crime. Studies on individuals diagnosed with DID are intimately associated with serious and incessant childhood trauma, and are very often linked to sexual abuse. JT was faced with many traumatic circumstances in her upbringing. Up until the age of 12, the same year of the murder, she had resided with her mother, Deshay. Her mother was a victim of childhood trauma herself and reported she had been sexually abused by more than one relative and grew up in a house of addicts. As her mother, Deshay, grew up, she imitated this behavior and had abused both alcohol and drugs most of her life. It was also learned through the investigation that Deshay had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, depression, and PTSD. It is unknown whether she ever received treatment for her conditions, but based on the history of her daughter, I would presume she never did. At the tender age of 15, Deshay had a son, and then a couple years later, a daughter. A few years after her second child was born, she had JT. All three children had different fathers. JT had been the result of an affair with a man named Edwin Torres, who was married and already had 2 children Initially, Edwin left his family and lived with JT and her mother for almost 7 years. As a small child, JT was exposed to her mother's ongoing struggles with substance abuse and the constant fighting between her parents. She was also a victim of her half-brother's rage, who punched her, choked her, and verbally abused her. JT was terrified of her half-brother, but she never told her parents about the abuse he put her through. When JT turned 8 years old, Edwin Torres left the house and returned to his wife and other children. Her mother, Deshay, spiraled into a darker cycle of violence and abuse. She ended up marrying a registered sex offender who physically abused her in front of JT. One incident was so severe that her mother, Deshay, was hospitalized for 3 to 4 days. JT also witnessed her mother cut herself with a knife during this period of her young and impressionable life. Fortunately, someone was paying attention to the abuse and neglect JT was exposed to, and the Department of Child Services eventually removed her and her half-brother from her mother's home. Her mother, Deshay, would attempt to clean up her life by divorcing her abusive husband, but she could not get hold of her addiction. And along with a pending criminal case, this prevented her from regaining custody of her children. During a psychological evaluation, a psychologist reported that it was almost certain that JT had been the victim of sexual abuse by someone who had lived inside her mother's house. Whether it was her half-brother or her abusive stepfather, JT continued to deny ever having been sexually abused. Once JT was removed from her mother's home, she was placed with her father, Edwin Torres, her stepmother, Maria, and their 2 kids. Imagine how awkward and potentially hostile an environment that would have been for this young girl. JT was ripped away from her mother, who exposed her to violence and neglected her entire life. Then the court places her with her father, her stepmother, and 2 teenagers she doesn't know. Given the circumstances, they undoubtedly felt some resentment towards her, at least indirectly, since their dad had left them and their mother to live with JT and Deshay. Understandably, it would have been a complicated and challenging living situation for all involved. At one point, Maria moved out of the apartment with her 2 kids, leaving JT to live alone with her father. About a year or 2 later, they would move back in. Although you would think her relationship with her stepmother, Maria, would have been strained at the very least, JT claimed they got along really great. She later would tell psychiatrists how Maria was not a replacement, but a real mom to me. Any abuse or negative behavior directed toward JT had allegedly been coming from her father. JT reported how her father verbally abused the entire family. Her father would call her a liar and tell her she made horrible decisions, just like her mother. His abuse wasn't limited to his daughter, JT. JT's half-sister once contacted the police when Edwin threatened to assault his son. School wasn't much better than her turbulent and violent home life for JT. She was often the target of bullies and had few friends. Her friend JP was in many respects the closest person in JT's life. She even shared with JP her struggles with her mental health and sanity. JP later revealed to investigators how JT experienced extreme mood swings. In fact, according to JP, she became a different person. JP described how one day at lunch, JT all of a sudden didn't recognize any of the friends they were hanging out with. JP believed it had been Star sitting with her at lunch that day. JT also told her friend JP that she didn't like Star, that she was scared of her, and feared that Star was becoming strong enough to take over. It wasn't just JP who was aware of her friend's battle with mental illness. When she lived with her mother, JT heard voices, including those of Star's and Anna's, and would see things that were not there. JT told her mother about what she was experiencing, but nothing was ever done to help this poor, mentally ill young girl. The voices only grew in intensity and frequency once she moved in with her father, who told her to shake it off. And when Maria and her father Edwin were reunited, the other 2 personalities only became louder and stronger. JT spoke of how Star screamed at her and pushed her to start fights. JT also believed that someone was watching her. Always. Even when she was in her own room, she could feel their eyes watching her. It got so extreme that she dressed behind the shower curtain. On some occasions, JT would not remember her actions or events that had happened at all. These blackouts sometimes even occurred while she was at school. When they did, other kids would tell her what she did or said, but she had no recollection of doing or saying anything. During this time, JT began experiencing horrible, debilitating headaches. JT later reported on several occasions that she did not remember much of that night. She said she blacked out several times earlier in the evening, and after she went into her bedroom and closed the door, she did not remember anything else until after she met with JP later that night. JT cried and begged for help from more than one person in her life. She never hid what she was experiencing. She was terrified and wanted someone to stop the voices inside her head, but no one listened until it was far too late. 2 months before the murder, she told her mother, father, and an aunt about what she was experiencing, but no one took her symptoms seriously. She specifically described to her father the blackouts, headaches, and that she was hearing voices. JT also discussed all of this with her school counselor, who contacted her father Edwin right away and encouraged him to get professional help for his daughter. He even gave her father the contact information for 2 different mental health clinics, but instead, her father Edwin Torres insisted that she go to the family doctor. The doctor, Dr. Thomas Sutula, reported that JT was hearing voices in her head and that their names were Star and Anna. But this doctor was not an expert to diagnose, much less properly treat this girl's mental illness. When she had appointments set up for counseling, JT was forced to miss them, first due to issues of insurance, and then later on because her father couldn't take her, since he had back surgery. This child's escalating mental health concerns were not prioritized, and as a result, everyone in her life, including her, would suffer for this neglect. On August 3, 2015, the state filed a petition for authority to file juvenile delinquency action and tendered a delinquency petition. It cited that JT's actions would constitute a felony if an adult had committed them. The juvenile court authorized the state to file the delinquency petition. Elizabeth Bellin was assigned as JT's guardian ad litem, also known as a GAL. GALs are essentially court-appointed individuals who are impartial and represent the interests of the juvenile during legal proceedings. She initially filed a report detailing the severity of JT's mental illness. The court immediately ordered that JT be placed under psychiatric evaluation and directed that the Elkhart County Probation Department look into alternative placement options. Only 2 days later, at the initial hearing, the state announced that they weren't actively seeking a juvenile waiver for the offender at this time. On August 13, 2015, JT filed a motion to determine her competency to understand and engage in legal proceedings. The juvenile court granted her motion and appointed mental health professionals to evaluate JT's mental state. It was during this time that the probation department looked into several alternate places for JT to receive treatment, including private and state-run facilities, but none of them were willing to accept her. Almost 2 months would pass until the juvenile court's evidentiary hearing was held. One evaluation revealed how JT was preoccupied with the clown, Laughing Jack, and that she was suffering from paranoia and hallucinations. 2 psychiatrists and 1 psychologist both testified that JT's symptoms were consistent with DID and PTSD. Another healthcare professional concluded that JT was quite immature for 12 years old, and that her behavior and the way she processed her thoughts and feelings mirrored a child much younger. They all supported the finding that JT was not competent to participate in her defense. The court directed that the Division of Mental Health and Addiction in Indiana house JT in a psychiatric facility until the time she was deemed competent. They initially objected to this request and sought a deputy attorney general to dispute this order. However, the juvenile court reaffirmed the direction, and on December 1, 2015, JT was transported to LaRue Carter Hospital for psychiatric treatment. Yet still, this severely mentally ill girl was not taken care of as she needed. The staff there claimed to have no experience restoring the mental competence of a juvenile, and they had doubts that it could be successful. Over the next year and a half, the juvenile court held a review hearing to gauge JT's advancement in treatment. Although there were some signs of her improvement, the girl still showed signs of both DID and PTSD. It was noted by more than one specialist that JT had been suffering from PTSD. We often correlate PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, with adult victims of trauma and violence, in particular veterans. But anyone who has experienced a traumatic event can develop PTSD. PTSD is characterized by symptoms which adversely affect mood, cognition, bodily experience, and behavior. Dissociative reactions such as a flashback can occur when a person feels or behaves as if they are re-experiencing the traumatic event. Such a reaction could be a brief momentary reaction or a total loss of awareness, including of oneself and their environment. This is reflective of the dissociative incidents JT continued to experience. The symptoms of PTSD mirror those of adults, but teens in particular are more likely to act out in more aggressive, risky, and self-destructive ways. PTSD can cause chronic impairment, result in comorbidity, specifically comorbid psychiatric disorder, which means simply that more than one disorder exists at once, and increases the risk of suicide. For children, they exhibit the symptoms in different ways, and therefore the criteria for evaluating children younger than 6 and older than 6 are distinct. Psychotherapy is encouraged to be the first line of treatment in children, with medication being avoided. It has been reported that children as young as 1 year old have experienced PTSD. Trauma is unique to the individual who experiences it. There is no way to predict or determine who may develop long-term mental health concerns as a result. Trauma, when concerning PTSD, is defined by the DSM-5 as exposure to actual or threatened death, sexual violence, or serious injury. This trauma can be experienced directly or indirectly. It may be the result of an individual's personal experience, or their witness to trauma, or even learning about trauma that someone else, in particular a close friend or family member, has dealt with. I have mentioned the concept of generational trauma in relation to indigenous people and other cultures and groups of people who have suffered great inflictions of violence, disparity, and genocide. This trauma and the emotional, physical, and psychological aftermath that results from these experiences can transfer itself onto other and younger generations. Research has also shown that this phenomenon exists within generations of a household where they have suffered personal violence and trauma. Similar to the theory of the intergenerational cycles of violence, the abuse continues from one generation to the next. When a child experiences and is exposed to violence within their home, they become victims of and often perpetrators of abuse. The child equates this treatment and these toxic, violent relationships as the norm, and it is what they expect and they often repeat as they become adults. Studies on children brought up in abusive homes show that they commonly develop behavioral problems, including regression, out-of-control behavior, and imitate the behaviors they are exposed to. Children are the most vulnerable to being victims of abuse and neglect, which can have long-term psychological effects on their brains during the most critical stages of development. Much of the research on trauma and its impact on children has been based on studies of child sexual abuse. Emotional trauma has a negative impact on a child's emotional relationships, profoundly affecting how they view themselves and the world. Physical, emotional, and mental abuse damages a child's basic sense of safety. Children who are physically abused and treated violently often become violent themselves. Proposed by Yanov Bolman in 1992, the shattered assumptions theory helps to explain the massive impact trauma can have, which leads to a child suffering from PTSD. Trauma in a child's life can drastically shift the way in which a child views themselves and the world around them. The basic beliefs that the world is kind, holds meaning, and that they are of worth are shattered once a traumatic event occurs. It is not surprising that intentional trauma versus nonviolent or accidental trauma is correlated with a much higher risk of developing PTSD, especially when the trauma is repetitive and prolonged. Studies show that females are more predisposed to PTSD than males. As far back as 1890, the strong connection between psychological trauma and mental illness has been established. Psychopathy is not to be confused with psychosis. Psychosis is the presence of either delusions or hallucinations, sometimes both. They impair thought disorder, can create behavioral disorganization, which includes patterns of illogical, inconsistent, and erratic actions, and even catatonia. Catatonia is characterized by abnormal movements, behaviors, or actions, or a complete lack of response to one's environment. Research has shown that before the onset of psychosis, it is very common for individuals to exhibit irregular or abnormal signs of social and cognitive development, also known as the prodrome. This interim stage of psychosis is often manifested in social withdrawal and strange, extreme, and even suspicious behavior. Youth in this stage frequently recognize that they are experiencing strange and abnormal sensations or feelings, although typically they have trouble acknowledging what they are seeing or hearing unless specifically asked. This behavior is often inaccurately diagnosed as a stage of major depressive disorder, which can lead to improper treatment. The emotions or affects shown by youth diagnosed with schizophrenia have traditionally been described as flat, but they can also display themselves in silly, even goofy behavior. The thought process is characterized by abstraction and disorder, exhibited in symptoms such as illogical or erratic thinking, a loss of sense of self and poor judgment and impulse control. Childhood or adolescent schizophrenia is believed to be caused by a combination of factors, including behavioral, environment, and genetic. The research has been extensive on the high risk of developing schizophrenia, in addition to other severe mental health disorders in relatives who have the disorder. The display of childhood psychosis in children younger than age 12 is extremely rare, with appearances of symptoms being a 60th as common as seen in adult onset psychosis. Long before any symptoms of psychosis are presented, children with schizophrenia in particular exhibit other signs. It can also be exhibited in delays in language and other cognitive functioning. Even children in their first few years of life may present psychological disorders in behaviors like posturing, rocking, or arm lapping. As babies grow, it may show itself in unusual crawling and later in anxious and disruptive behavior. Psychotic symptoms in children and adolescents are more likely a result of non-schizophrenic conditions, specifically bipolar disorder, major depression, and dissociative identity disorder. Symptoms of psychosis in children are most often manifested in impaired functioning, flat affect, social isolation, and hallucinations. DID, or dissociative identity disorder, is an extremely rare kind of mental health disorder. Formerly known as multiple personality disorder, there is no exact data on how many individuals suffer from this condition. This is mainly due to the diagnosis being very complicated, and the symptoms can resemble other illnesses, specifically bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. I covered this topic quite extensively back in episode 22, Killer Inside My Mind, which details the tragic story of Juanita Maxwell. It's a fascinating and heartbreaking story of how a woman dealt with her childhood trauma. Believed to impact roughly 1.5% of the U.S. population, there is still minimal research done on this mental health disorder, and some mental health professionals dispute its existence at all. DID is even more rare in children, but since the disorder is known for being triggered by the result of severe and prolonged trauma in childhood, it is not surprising that some children begin to show symptoms very young. According to Frank Putnam, a psychiatrist for the National Institute of Mental Health, when a young child is a victim of severe abuse, whether it is physical, sexual, and/or extreme neglect, they are helpless to fight off or even avoid their perpetrator. In order to escape this dark reality, dissociation may be the only way for them to endure their suffering by shielding themselves from the truth. When an individual dissociates, their brain's processing of memory is disrupted, so there is little, if any, memory left of the trauma. Traumatized children may dissociate anywhere at any time. Very much like JT, it could be at home, inside the classroom, or somewhere in public. It makes perfect logical sense that the more dissociation a person, but especially a child, experiences, the more their memories, emotions, and thought processes counteract with normal functioning and can cause a major increase in socialization problems. As with adults, an accurate diagnosis for a child has faced many obstacles. Children are often misdiagnosed with depression and ADHD, which results to improper treatment and therapy. According to Jeffrey Haugard, a professor of human development at Cornell University, there are specific symptoms that children in particular who suffer from DID are known to experience. These may include what others describe as daydreaming or spacing out, but they are experiencing trance-like states that the children escape to. Children may also not understand why someone is upset with them because they don't remember what happened during an episode. A child may also exhibit extreme changes in how they look, what they're interested in, what foods they eat, games they play, and even severe, unexpected, and sometimes hard to believe changes shown in their language, accent, or even how they speak or write. DID is frequently associated with periods of lost time, and children may experience not remembering an entire day. Children with DID have also been reported as having an imaginary friend at a much younger age than is usually seen. They are more likely to develop these imaginary friends as young as 2 to 3 years old, and frequently have more than one. These friends may not always behave or act in the best interest of the child. Children with DID may break out into periods of rage or violence that seemingly arise for no known reason. Children with this disorder have difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagination. Typically, whereas a child stops believing in imaginary friends at the latest 10 years old, a child with dissociative identity disorder may believe in them for years, much after this mark. On March 23, 2017, JT's competency was formally reassessed by 2 mental health care professionals. They filed that JT was competent to stand trial. The court then held a hearing to determine if her competency had been restored. A week later, the state filed a motion for waiver of juvenile court. They sought to prosecute JT as an adult. For a juvenile to be waived to criminal court in Indiana, there are specific requirements that the court must determine. The juvenile court shall waive jurisdiction if, following a full investigation and hearing, the court finds that the child is charged with an act that would constitute murder if committed by an adult. Second, there is a probable cause to believe that the juvenile has committed the act. And third, the child was at least 12 years old when the act was allegedly committed. That is, unless the court determines that it is in the best interest of the child and the safety and welfare of the community that they remain within the juvenile system. After the initial hearing on October 4th, a secondary evaluation was ordered to be performed on JT. After the final evaluation was conducted on January 19th, 2018, it was officially determined that JT was now competent. The state would now present their case to prosecute her as an adult. Multiple evidentiary hearings took place between April and June of that same year. The court determined that the state had provided sufficient enough evidence to meet the statutory elements of the juvenile waiver, but that the mitigating circumstances surrounding JT changed the course of this direction. It was determined that JT and her counsel had proven that it was in the best interest of the child, as well as the safety and welfare of the community, for her to remain in the juvenile system instead of being handled in criminal court. The state filed a motion of discretionary interlocutory appeal. This is an appeal made in the intermediate stages before the conclusion of a legal proceeding or judgment of a case. The reason this is done is that so one side can address critical issues without having to wait for the final decision. This motion was granted by the court with the exception of holding JT in a secure residential facility for the duration. Although she continued to receive treatment, it was addressed in her cross-appeal how several residential mental health providers refused her treatment due to the pending case. In the interim of the appellate hearing, JT was transferred back to the Juvenile Delinquency Corrections in 2018 after she was declared competent to stand trial. Her ongoing symptoms only escalated after she was taken into the JDC. According to her gal Bellin, JT told her she was hearing voices in her head, telling her to do things, and that her hallucinations were increasing in frequency. She was suffering from blackouts, headaches, and she couldn't sleep. JT told gal Bellin that 6 months before the incident, she had asked her mother, father, stepmother, and her aunt for help, but no one paid attention to the desperate pleas she made. If only the adults in her life had listened when JT began exhibiting signs of psychosis. Her violent behavior and exacerbated mental illness may have been prevented. The situation was also traumatic for gal Bellin. Each visit was accompanied by JT screaming, crying, and begging for help. One moment she would be rational and coherent. The next she would be talking in circular form and not make any sense. Based on her experiences with JT, gal Bellin firmly believed that the hospital may have been safe for JT, but it was not treating her appropriately or effectively enough in terms of therapy. JT was also openly frustrated with the doctors for not treating her for DID because she still felt Anna and Star with her. According to gal Bellin, however, JT's symptoms seemed to come back in full force. She was suffering from episodes of self-harm. JT was plagued with headaches and insomnia. Most concerning is that the voices were back, and they were stronger and angrier than ever. In April of that year, JT was having suicidal ideations and communicated this to her probation officer. In response, she was placed on 5-minute checks. A week later, they rushed her to the emergency room with a panic attack. She spoke about the voices she was still hearing and told them about how her family had done nothing to help her. A couple weeks later, JT once again reported thoughts of killing herself. 2 days after this, she identified herself as Star and Anna to the staff members of the JDC. She exhibited 2 glaringly different personalities. One was full of rage, the other childlike giddiness. Then they found JT cutting herself, to which she said she had all intention of continuing to harm herself. Again, they took her into the ER, where she was treated and then returned back to the JDC. On May 15th, she contacted a therapist describing how people kept screaming at her inside her head and they just wouldn't stop. This time, when JT was transferred to the emergency room, she was unresponsive, except she told the doctors, "I didn't want to come. She is going to be pissed off." 3 days later, she called her therapist, terrified. She told them that she was scared of switching and someone else getting hurt. When JT was moved from the JDC to the hospital in December of that year, a doctor placed her on Risperdal, which is an antipsychotic drug. She continued on this medication through early March 2016. Contrary to the initial physicians who evaluated JT's mental state, the primary doctor there who treated her, Dr. Saeed Khan, did not see any signs of DID. He did, however, believe that she was suffering from PTSD. The medication and therapy seemed to have made a drastic change in her mood and behavior. By the end of that period, JT had a positive contact record and was reported as being one of the most well-behaved residents. She also began to improve in school and was earning good grades. While a resident at the hospital, JT talked with a counselor every week, and she was finally capable of processing the grief and regret she felt over causing Maria's death. Although JT's mental state did exhibit some positive signs, she continued to experience symptoms of dissociation, PTSD, severe depression, and psychosis. The young girl's battle with her sanity was far from over. A report by Dr. Jeffrey Vanderwater Piercy, who assessed her competency, found that JT's mental state illustrated a very severe and complicated clinical picture. It was also recorded how she held a great amount of anger toward her parents, whom she believed had let her down by not getting her the psychiatric help when she asked for it. Her gal Bellin visited every month while she resided in the hospital. JT continued to tell her very disturbing things that she was hearing and seeing, which was sometimes the opposite of what she was conveying to the staff. JT confessed to gal Bellin while she was at LaRue Carter Hospital, she saw shadows and figures moving around the room at night. She became so paranoid at one point she even booby-trapped her room. She prevented the bookshelves from falling forward or the doors opening. There was a painting of a tree on the wall, which JT described how the tree had arms, and they were waving around. The voices she heard were more or less whispers, and most of the time, JT couldn't make out what they were saying. Gal Bellin later testified in court that she believed JT was actively minimizing her symptoms with the hopes that she would be released. The exact type of mental illness or illnesses JT was inflicted with varied depending on her diagnosis from psychiatrists. In November 2015, she was assessed by Dr. Alan Barsman, who was a specialist in the field of child psychiatry. He recommended that she undergo extensive therapy for both DID and PTSD as soon as possible. However, as mentioned earlier, Dr. Syed Khan from the hospital disagreed that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder, but he did believe she was experiencing severe PTSD. Around the time she was experiencing heightened symptoms of her mental illness, Dr. Antoinette Kavanaugh, a forensic psychologist, was brought on to assess JT's competency. She interviewed JT, her parents, her half-sister, and gal Bellin to determine whether or not it was appropriate to try JT as an adult. When she had JT fill out several diagnostic questionnaires and personality assessments, she was taken back by the extent of abuse and neglect the young girl had endured in her life. JT indicated that she had been emotionally and physically neglected and abused and had been severely sexually abused. In fact, her scores in comparison to other female juveniles who were in residential treatment programs who had committed similar felonious acts revealed levels of abuse and neglect that were much worse than any others she had previously assessed. The doctor also determined that JT had severe issues of depression, memory, and suffered from disordered thinking. She believed that the goal needed to be focused on fusing her personalities together while beginning to understand the trauma that had triggered her mental illness. Dr. Kavanaugh also testified in court that JT did not exhibit any kind of antisocial or conduct disorder, which many other juveniles who act out in violent ways have. She stated that if it weren't for her severe mental illness, JT would not pose a threat to herself or anyone else. During the state's presentation of evidence to support JT being waived to criminal court, they introduced elements of premeditation. JT's behavior on the night of the attack brought into question her lack of criminal culpability due to her mental illness. It was learned that JT had made specific plans to leave her home on the night of the murder. She had sent a text to her friend JP to meet her at the park near her house at 10 p.m. JP, who was her friend, was fully aware of her alternate personalities, Star and Anna, with whom she had had more than one interaction with. Within the text in all caps, she wrote that she could not take it anymore, and she expressed to her friend JP how she was about to snap. The text between the two girls discussed what to bring for supplies like food, water, and clothes. JP shared later with the police that she believed it was Star who was texting her that night. The search on her mobile phone revealed that JT had looked up some bizarre and suspicious things online. The girl had searched how to make poison and sharpen knives. JT looked up how to hide from law enforcement and survive in the woods. There was also a very disturbing video she had searched with individuals stabbed to death, a website with violent stories like creepypasta, and for the song Pop Goes the Weasel. That song, as aforementioned, was in connection with Laughing Jack. JP later told investigators that JT said her signal upon arrival at the park that night would be whistling that song. She also had hidden weapons that were used in the attack, specifically the knives, in her room. JT had also started a fire in her bedroom and disabled the smoke alarm to help lure Maria to her room and initiate the assault. Now, what I find to be so interesting and tends to make me a bit hesitant to believe that JT does have DID is that she was aware of her alternate personalities. Based on the in-depth research I have done on this subject, the host personality, that is the primary individual, is unaware or conscious of the other personalities. Apparently, some physicians disagree on whether the factor of this condition is true, and in some circumstances, the host may be aware that they have multiple personalities. I'm not an expert on the matter, nor a psychiatrist, but it seems that if the host is aware, then that defeats the primary purpose of the other personalities, which is to protect and shield the host. Nevertheless, it can't be denied that JT is a severely mentally ill young girl. Even though the state presented a strong case for waiving juvenile jurisdiction over the young defendant, the juvenile court denied its request based on the evidentiary hearing. This is a required procedure that occurs when the state has filed a petition to waive a juvenile offender. As mentioned in previous episodes, it provides both sides the opportunity to present their reasons for or against the waiving of a juvenile. Everything from delinquent history, known childhood background, and mental health, in addition to the specific circumstances, including aggravating and mitigating factors of the case surrounding the incident, are presented during this hearing. It couldn't be denied that JT fared far worse after she was returned to corrections versus her residential stay at the hospital. The juvenile court would come to the conclusion that JT needed to remain in a secure residential facility versus being sent to the Justice Department of Corrections and be given proper treatment by medical professionals, ideally those who specialized in DID. The state did their best to argue that JT may still be placed in a residential facility within the Department of Corrections if tried as an adult, but the juvenile court wasn't taking their chances. In addition to the fact that the Department of Corrections is not trained to treat DID, nor do they treat underlying trauma. JT will be held at a residential facility and continue to receive psychiatric treatment for her mental illness until she turns 21, unless something radical, especially something violent, occurs during that time frame that requires the juvenile court or the state to intervene. JT will be released back into society with no record of any kind. What is encouraging is that if a child is diagnosed and begins treatment early, their prognosis is very positive. Adults and children alike are most often treated with psychotherapy. Nonverbal forms like art, play therapy, and hypnosis are especially effective for younger patients since it helps them to act out or express the trauma differently and can be much easier than openly talking about it. Children diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder have a much higher rate of recovery than adults. Mental health disorders affect a large number of adolescents, and the numbers only continue to increase each year. In 2023, 1 in 5 12 to 17-year-olds were diagnosed with suffering from some form of mental health condition. Anxiety was the most common, followed by depression. The third most common was conduct behavior disorder. Individuals with schizophrenia and similar mental health disorders face an increased risk of suicide. Research has revealed that 90% of youth who kill themselves had a mental disorder, and upward of 30% of schizophrenic patients attempt suicide at least once. Population-based studies, which often involve self-reporting, have discovered that higher than 25% of children and adolescents have experienced some form of psychosis. Some studies done on suicide prevention in high school students have shown an unexpectedly high correlation of 34% of students who experienced auditory hallucinations and those with suicidal ideation. Ideally, and most often, a parent or guardian of the child would report concerns of mental health, in particular when there are signs of psychosis. But what can be done for someone like JT when a child's symptoms are ignored? A young girl's fears and cries for help are pushed aside. In the case of JT, her counselor immediately reached out to her father and encouraged him to get his daughter professional help. He minimized and did not prioritize getting his sick daughter treatment. Her father and all of the adults in her life failed this poor, sick young girl. She was desperate, wanting their help, told them everything she was experiencing and how scared and sick she was. And they did nothing to get the help this girl needed until the worst possible scenario played out. I wonder whether her mother and father have supported her throughout this process and tried to make amends for the trauma they put her through and acknowledge how they failed her. There are many cases in which I struggle whether a young offender should be tried as an adult or remain within the juvenile court. But in the case of JT, I agree wholeheartedly with the juvenile court's decision to prioritize her psychological well-being and treatment over penalizing her. All of the signs of mental illness were there, and this young, sick little girl begged for professional help multiple times. Unfortunately, for her victim and the entire family, her cries were not taken seriously enough. I can only hope that time and treatment will heal her trauma and that JT can fully recover from her mental illness. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. Please share your opinion on whether or not you agree with the juvenile court's decision. Please participate in the poll I have provided. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets. Next door. Especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.